Hello, everyone. Welcome back. On behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Princeton University, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. Hello to everyone here in Princeton, hello to everyone at the partner locations, and hello to everyone tuning in on the live stream. It's my great pleasure to welcome today our speaker, Chris Wiggins, and I should actually say welcome back, Chris Wiggins, because he received his PhD from Princeton in physics, and he studied the partial differential equations approach to biopolymers.
Sure.
And actually, before the talk, we had a nice walk around the physics building, and we got to see the room where Chris defended his dissertation. So Chris is a very interesting person, and in part because he wears many different hats, and I think this gives him a distinctive view into the field of data science. So he is a professor of applied math at Columbia University and a founding member of the executive committee for Columbia's Data Science Institute. He's also the chief data scientist of the New York Times, and he is a co-founder and co-organizer of Hack-NY, which organizes student hackathons in New York and also has a structured internship program which pairs students and startups. So in part because of all of that different exposure to all the different parts of the data science ecosystem, he has a very distinctive view. I know this year I've been on sabbatical at the Times, in part hanging out with Chris's group, which I found to be very enjoyable. He's also a wonderful host. And so what he's going to be talking about today is what should future statisticians, CEOs, senators, and I would add computational social scientists know about the history of data and ethics. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you. So this is going to be an unusual talk. It's really a talk about a class and sort of a preview or a selecta of certain things that we taught in the class and certain things that we learned. Also, this is the first time I'm giving this talk ever, so apologies if I have a lack of logical coherence. But it's a talk about things that we learned in this class that we taught, and the three icons I chose here were a dumpster fire, because the class was in part about problems, Buzz Lightyear, because we wanted to approach the problems with a sense of optimism, in the sense that we do have weapons at our disposal to address those problems, and Jupiter, because the class was about trying to bring together what is sometimes called critical and functional literacies in data science. That is, we actually opened up Python and engaged with the data sets that we were reading about. As advertised, I have a couple of hats, but the talk today is really about is really derived from the first of those hats. And in particular, this talk derives from a class that I developed over the last 3 years with Matt Jones, who's a professor in the history department. And if you'd like to know more about the class, it's all on the GitHub. So the talk aim is to investigate what we all think future statisticians, computational social scientists, and others should know about the history of and ethics of data. Both of those things are absent from what I, as an applied mathematician or data scientist, am supposed to be talking about. So first, we should probably talk about why you would want to talk about history, for trying to understand history, for understanding data, and also what is the role of ethics within what we think people should know for the next century or so about data. So to address that, I'm going to show you a couple of things that we taught in the class, and then close by saying what we actually learned here, we the faculty. What did we learn by trying to teach this class the last 3 years? As a way of preamble, though, I should say how this class actually came to be. So this class began in a happy event. For faculty members, a happy event is when the university asks if anybody would like to receive money. So there was this email we got one day in May of 2016 saying, hey, would anybody like to apply for money? And I forwarded it to Matt Jones in history and said, hey, interested in applying? And he said, you beat me to the forward. Yes, let's do it. I said, great. And we got the grant. So that's a happy story, because the grant was specifically to try to get new classes created by faculty from 2 different schools. I'm in the engineering school. Matt is in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Some preamble is that Matt and I had already met each other. The way we came to know each other was from a talk. So Matt gave this talk in spring of 2013 called A Tale of Two Algorithms Towards a History of Data Mining, which was a pretty good talk. I went to this talk, and as it'll be more clear in a few slides, Tale of Two Algorithms to me makes me think about Leo Breiman and sort of this heretical school of statisticians developing machine learning and data science. So I thought the whole talk was going to be about Leo Breiman and statisticians, but actually it was about the history of government mining of people's personal data. So after the talk, I said, well, Matt, that was pretty interesting, but you know, you really should talk about Leo Breiman and other things like that. Who cares about the history of people mining, government mining of people's personal data? And of course, later that month, the Snowden revelations happened. And so Matt really skated towards where the puck was going to go. It was obviously a very timely topic. And thereafter, Matt and I got to collaborate in the summer of 2014. And I invoke this because a lot of the design of the class was inspired by lessons we learned trying to teach data science to journalism students. So in the summer of 2014, we were co-developers of this program, a post-bac program for journalists to introduce them to Python algorithms and data journalism. And it was also a very GitHub-heavy class, you know, in the sense of reproducibility, in the sense of sort of showing all our work to students. So, you know, the organizers of the class included me and Matt and Kathy O'Neill, who some of you may know, and somebody who works from Digital Humanities. So that was very useful to us as a background when we decided to try to create a new class in the history and ethics of data. So that's why we might want to, that's the origin story rather. So why history? So Matt is coming from history. He's a real professional historian, whereas I am merely a fan of history. But my sense is that The Onion was right when The Onion said that it's useful to take a check at what happens in the past before making any big decisions. By which I mean that history is operationalizable. It is not a constraint on what we do. It gives you a new framework for thinking about decisions to be made. It also, I think, is useful for encouraging people not to panic. So when things seem to be in a dumpster fire, I think it's useful to look at previous dumpster fires and see about what ways that people got out of it before. It's also, I think, very useful to look at all the different realities that could have been by looking back at history and realizing not that things had to be that way, but in fact there's a lot of things that are in our world and our worldview also that are sort of historical accidents or were greatly contested. And looking at things that were contested gives you a sense for how things might be in the future. I benefited from very historical technical training. For example, just a few hundred meters over in that direction, I had the pleasure of taking Jim Peebles' quantum mechanics class, I think in the fall of '93. And Peebles opened up his class with a very historical look at quantum mechanics and how it got that way. And he broke it into a series of transitions. You know, the realization of black body radiation as a quantum phenomena was transformative in our understanding of the world. The realization of Schrödinger equation opened up a whole bunch of new capabilities. And he taught also, you know, things that were contested. So, you know, cold fusion was announced in '89. By '92, it was still useful to write a textbook about why that didn't make sense from a quantum mechanical perspective. And I think understanding even a technical field in terms of intellectual transitions, assigning names to the people who were participating in those transitions, and understanding how each of those transitions was contested, I think is liberating for helping us think about different possible futures we may create. Now, that's about transitions in the sciences. I was much older when I really understood something else about transitions in engineering. And that is the creation of a new capability, particularly a new capability which you make transportable. That is, you take some capability and you had some particular intent in your mind for why that you want to make that capability, but then you make it portable to other people in the form of some technology. It has an impact on how people are able to do what to whom. And it made an impact on me when I later read this paper by the cryptographer Philip Rogoway, who opens the paper by saying cryptography rearranges power. It configures who can do what from what. This makes cryptography an inherently political tool, which was a realization to me because given my technical training, I only used the word politics when I was talking about voting and things like that. But to think about developing capabilities and making them portable as having an impact on who can do what to whom, and therefore impact in the dynamics of power and being political, I think was an epiphany for me in thinking about it. And the reason I looked at this paper was it was sent to me by a data science friend who was saying, you know, you could replace cryptography with data science and think the same thing. Making a new data science algorithm rearranges power. which we wanted to investigate in our class. Which brings us to why ethics. Why did we want to include ethics in the class? Well, in part, it was from student interest. There's a broad sense from our students over the last 3 years that broadly construed something is wrong on the internet. And they're getting that not only from their personal usage, but from a variety of books. One example from 2 years ago was Cathy O'Neill's book, which is largely about data and algorithms and mathematics. More recently, Sophia Noble's book, which is a great illustration of how algorithms as designed can reinforce oppression. And then the same month, Virginia Eubank's book about how technology systems can reinforce inequality algorithmically. And then this year, a good piece by Shoshana Zuboff tying those algorithms into surveillance capitalism and how money and capitalism can also reinforce those dynamics. Among many others, I don't mean this as a comprehensive list, but this is a kind of thing that's happening in the background of our students who come to this class. Why students are interested in ethics also has a slight dynamic in terms of how the students self-identify. So if I can use a framing from when I was an undergraduate, when people used to talk about techies and fuzzies, not in any sort of evaluative sense of the word, but techies being people having some sort of STEM major and fuzzies being sort of everything else, they're coming from the humanities. The techies that we teach, I think, have a more applied and personal interest in understanding ethics, in part because, you know, being an engineer in a large company doesn't mean you're not going to jail. As one example recently was, here's a press release from the Department of Justice in 2017 about an engineer who went to jail for, I believe, 3 years for his role in a Volkswagen's duplicitous software to prevent detecting of emissions. And that impacts young students. Here's a story from our local paper claiming that a bunch of students no longer want to work at Facebook. And the article goes on to talk about the luster of Facebook being somewhat dulled over the calendar year 2018. So that's the role. That was why we wanted to talk about history and also talk about ethics. Now, a part of the talk, I want to talk to you about what we actually taught. So as a sort of an infographic or an intellectual arc, we took a historical approach starting in the late 18th century. So we started with statistics when it still meant statecraft, when it still meant trying to make sense of the state before it had anything to do with numbers and data, let alone mathematics. And then went through a set of transitions as people started trying to apply mathematical methods to societies and to individuals. And as mathematics and academia sort of embraced that field and it became relevant to mathematics, to modeling, a major transition with the birth of digital computation during World War II. And then the whole subject sort of gets taken up by industry thereafter. So really this arc just describes what happens in weeks 3 through 11 of a 14-week class. This is the historical bit. You may wonder why we chose 1770s. Every big history class has to start somewhere, so somewhat arbitrarily we chose the year that statistics first entered the English language. Here's where statistics entered the English language, by the way. In an encyclopedia saying, statistics teaches us what is the political arrangement of the modern states of the known world. That is, you know, statistics didn't have anything to do with math or even numbers. Statecraft, which was a very applied statement about what the craft was meant to do and what sort of power it was interested in negotiating. Okay, this was a translation from a German document, but the point I wanted to make here is we had to break class into weeks, because that's the way classes are taught. So we broke it into a series of intellectual transitions around who was doing what to whom and whether the subject was considered about aggregating data, or about mathematical modeling, or a martial concern, meaning wartime usage, or a commercial concern later. How do we integrate ethics throughout? The way we integrate ethics throughout is we teach a series of intellectual transformations, but we always have a discussion of the political precondition and the political postcondition. That is, once you've closed the week, you've discussed some intellectual transition, you can say, how did this intellectual transition rearrange power? Who now could do what, from what, and to whom? And that's pretty broad, so to try to make it slightly more analytic, we tried every week to emphasize the role of rights, so human rights and the rights of people, harms, and how did this do something good or bad to people, and justice. How was that harm evenly distributed? I didn't include weeks 1 and 2, but weeks 1 and 2 were largely about just sort of setting the stakes and introducing people to harms and justices around data. So those were the Tuesday's discussions. So as a list of topics, the weeks 3 through 11 were really the intellectual transition weeks, the historical weeks. But those Tuesday discussions were paired with Thursday labs. So on Thursday, we actually fired up Python, pre-authored in Jupyter Notebooks, and each week we had a lab associated with the reading from Tuesday. So we went through and we took some data from the UCI data set. We interrogated the data and really read critically about how the data were created, what assumptions went into how the data were described. Some exploratory data analysis, which you can do easily in Python even before we start talking about statistics or models. We went on and did some things that you'll recognize, like p-value hacking. We introduced people to machine learning through an interactive tool, so that the interactive notebook just says, here are 3 types of machine learning, and then you can interact and understand overfitting with a slider. And when it came time to talk about privacy, we created our own database of ruin by taking data from students who had consented, and then thinking about how we would make that data set more and more anonymous, under a technical definition of anonymous. So I thought maybe I would spend a little time taking a few of the topics and showing you in more detail the kind of treatment we were trying to get at by pairing readings with labs. So starting with week 4, which was about the origin of the word regression and about sort of the Victorian program at the end of the 19th century. We got a lot of work, got a lot of use out of Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man. Even before we started talking about mathematical modeling, just talking about how people subjectively acquired data. Great story about basically people's brain sizes and the incredible contortions people went under to put the right size beans in the right size skulls to prove out their preconceived notions. So there's a great section from Gould about that. And then we could go and talk about Sir Francis Galton and how he had his own agenda under the word regression. He gave us the word regression, as well as the word correlation, as well as the word eugenics. So we try to speak about that directly, and we can do that by taking Galton's original data. So the lab class on Friday actually takes Galton's original paper, takes Galton's original data, explores it, and does the first regression. That is, we can give away a Jupyter Notebook in which you not only do regression, you do the first regression ever, which in this case was trying to figure out why exceptionally great men, as quantified by their heights, nonetheless suffer from having less great sons who are not as tall. Of course, height was a tool for Galton for understanding other things about the greatness of men. But the most important part of these labs, of course, is the little part that says, now it's your turn. So these labs are interactive. We distribute the Jupyter Notebook, and we grade people in part by their participation during the labs for coming up with their own, in this case, regressions. The next week, week 5, we talked about the origins of IQ and policy, so where data starts getting used to try to make policy statements about what we should do with people. So the same book, but a different section of the book, now talking about IQ, and the original creation of a general intelligence factor, or G factor, which is really the origin of PCA in the modern sense. For example, here we're interested in something like taking a 0.6 of your classic score and 0.56 of your French score and adding them together into a composite score, which in the end, if you read the original paper, says which people should be in the trenches and which people should be officers. That is, there's always been a power dynamic to the way people use data. After that, we talk about Yule and the way Yule in 1898 had one of the very first one of the first applied in the social sciences uses of multivariate regression, in which case Yule was looking at the number of poor people in different regions of the United Kingdom as a function of how much assistance was given to people outside of their home and how many people were living in a poorhouse. And as David Friedman excellently says, the coefficient associating how many people get assistance with how many people are poor being positive, Yule concluded that giving people help causes poverty. We can then take those data. So on Thursday, we fire up the original paper. The paper, you'll note, has the title Causes of Changes in Pauperism in England. That is directly, even in the 19th century, we were already confusing correlation and causation. Right? From the very first applied multivariate statistics in the social sciences, causes is right in the title, even though it's ordinary least squares. So we redo that ordinary least squares, and then encourage students to regress a bit on their own. We also look at Simpson's paradox. Simpson's paradox, you may know, is most famously associated with this case of admissions at Berkeley, and the claim that admissions was systematically sexist because women were had a lower admission rate in different departments. And Bickel and others, there's a nice paper from Bickel that we reproduce in this lab, argued that it's not that women are more discriminated against, it's just that the women are applying to the difficult departments. In week 7, we look at the birth of digital computation in World War II. So there's a nice paper by, nice, very legible book by Sharon McGrain about Bayes' theorem. So we took her chapters about World War II. We talk a lot about the hardware that was created for the sole purpose of code breaking. Like before World War II, there wasn't this kind of statistical special purpose hardware. And right away, like at the birth of specialized hardware, like right when data becomes about labor, immediately you see the gendering of labor. So it's a nice historical vignette because you can look at like modern discussions of like front end and back end or any other sort of gendered association of computation, and it's right there at the dawn of computation. There's a lot of great work by Janet Abat, and one of them is this paper, Breaking Codes and Finding Trajectories, on both sides of the Atlantic. So this is a pair of quotes from a Colossus operator in the UK and an ENIAC programmer in Philadelphia. And in both cases, it's extremely well documented with a bunch of original interviews about how the physical part of the labor, as opposed to the mathematical or computational part, was divided, gendered, and lowered in importance. So then the lab associated with that is about Bayesian cryptography. We introduce people to the Viognier cipher and introduce them to some code breaking and some decryption and show you how that works. And then we say, try your own. So again, in all of these parts of these labs, we leverage Jupyter because it allows people to just get started, right? I mean, once you have the Jupyter notebook, you can press Shift Return and magic happens, and then you can go in and break it. So we found that very useful for getting people functionally to engage with data. By week 9, we're talking about privacy debates and big data as it was understood 1950 to 1980. We introduced them to one turning point, which is the reification and canonization of business intelligence by IBM employees. And then we give them an excerpt from this great new book by Sarah Igo, who also got her PhD here at Princeton, history professor. And in terms of original primary literature, there's a great book called The Assault on Privacy from 1971, right, which is very modern sounding if you go read it now. And then in terms of putting data to work for understanding people's lives and deciding, for example, who gets a loan, we look at this great paper by Martha Poon, which is an extremely labor-intensive paper. She goes and tracks down, I think, 12 or 14 of the people who originally worked for Fair Isaac and Company, trying to create these scores by going through people's credit records and subjectively deciding whether these people were creditworthy or not, which became the basis for a statistical model, which now rules our lives. So one of the things that Igo's book is great for is for showing students that privacy as a debate is not new. It was a very well forged subject on both sides of the political spectrum, by the way, in the early 70s. It's just that it was privacy, it was about our private data, but being used by the state, as opposed to the way our private data is used by private companies. And it was also a time of great consumer protection and regulation. Okay, and then for the lab, we fire up some of the documents that were presented to Congress with sort of scary infographics about the corporate state complex. We fire up an example of a database, namely the database from Movie Lens of people's different movie recommendations. We teach them joins and group buys and things like that. And then we tell them about why there was no Netflix challenge number 2. Does everybody know why there was no Netflix challenge number 2? One shaking head, please.
They get sued?
Well, I'll give you a technical reason. The technical reason is re-identification. And actually, Arvin, who's a professor here, had a hand in that. But you can go through and re-identify people, even the anonymized data from the Netflix release, given that you have other data where people have said what movies they like. Okay. We took a look at data science. It's tough to boil all of data science down to a few papers since Actually, David Donahoe in the next door over a few years ago argued that it goes back to 1962. So we took John Tukey's paper from 1962, which if you've never read, it's an amazing statistics paper because it opens up very autobiographical and very confessional. I've long thought I was a statistician, but now I've had cause to wonder and to doubt. And Leo Breiman's paper, Statistical Modeling the Two Cultures, which I mentioned earlier. And then Donahoe's own 50 Years of Data Science, which sort of explains how data science as a mindset has its origin in the way that Bell Labs in particular was dealing with abundant telecommunications data. Also, we took this nice paper by Gina Neff from Oxford, which came out last year, that makes clear that a lot of people in data science are actually quite reflexive, as she puts it. That is, a lot of people in data science are actually quite aware of the subjective design choices they're making when they choose an algorithm, when they choose how to pre-process the data, even though it is often pictured that data scientists are not thinking about these things. That, you know, in her experience, and this is sort of an ethnographic paper, she looks at these people and says, actually, data scientists are quite reflexive. For the lab that week, we have this 3 kinds of machine learning interactive for supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement. We allow students to tune the knob and try to overfit data under these 3 contexts, and then build on Leo Breiman's observation about the pluses and minuses of predictive power and interpretable power by looking at decision trees and random forests, and draw attention to Breiman's own assessment of his own method. Random forests are A+ predictors, but it's difficult to understand, whereas, you know, decision trees, they rate an F, right? Breiman gave his own technique an F for interpretability. Okay, so at that point, by week 12, students have also gone through the death of AI and the rebirth of AI, and they're starting to understand the impact of algorithms on their daily lives. So by that time, you know, weeks 3 through 11, we're constantly closing by saying, how did this capability rearrange power? How did it impact rights, harms, and justice? So by that time, by week 12, they're really ready for some sort of more analytic look at this sort of vague sense that something is wrong on the internet. So we leverage a great textbook for this, which my understanding is that my understanding is that everyone in the room has already read this book. Good. We particularly leveraged chapter 6, which was very useful for me in thinking through ethics in an analytical framework. We also read through this great recent paper by LaTanya Sweeney. It's tough to choose a great paper from LaTanya Sweeney because all of her papers are great, but this one was a particularly good one that balanced the tech and the impact. It's one of many papers that pictures this re-identification idea that if I hand you a data set, it is not, you can call it anonymous because your name's not in it, but if I give you a bunch of other columns and there's another data table somewhere that has those same columns and your name, then those other columns effectively are a join key to put those 2 tables together, and now I know your name, as LaTanya so dramatically illustrated in 1999 when she mailed the governor of Massachusetts his own health records. And then finally, we tried, particularly in the latter part of the class, to include things from as recently as possible. So this was one week where we, the week before, Kate Crawford and Meredith Whitaker had just been interviewed by Kara Swisher, so we were able to include that as a nice piece about all the things that can go wrong around privacy. Now, we followed Professor Selganik's treatment of ethics, which is to talk about how this one time that ethics was made into a government spec, right? So there was one very remarkable time in the United States history where the idea of ethics was tried to make operationalizable to government specification, right? And that was from the Tuskegee experiment. Now, my understanding is everyone in the room has already studied Tuskegee experiment, so I don't need to tell those of you who are in the room. Maybe those of you who are on the internet will be introduced to it. But to start it with a bang, we introduced people to the front page of the New York Times, our local paper, in July of 1972, announcing, thanks to a whistleblower, an experiment on African American men in Alabama who got no treatment for syphilis for 40 years. As mentioned, I'm pretty sure this is in Professor Selganik's book also, but it was not clandestine, right? The people who were doing it didn't think they were doing something that they needed to hide from the outside world or from other doctors. They thought it was a perfectly fine thing to do. Could have been helped. Deeply, deeply racist, right? So again, it's on African American men. If you want to read this article about the racism in research, you know, grab some tissues before you start reading it because the quotes are amazing. I could read you from some quotes from it, but I might start crying during the talk. Such a flashpoint for US government that the US government had to create some sort of design for enforcing ethics. And so some of the ways that we talked about it in class were, what do we abstract from the experience of the Belmont Report? What do we extract from the experience of years and years and years of a group of people, including philosophers, practicing researchers, and a lot of people who are not researchers, gathering to try to think about what we talk about when we talk about ethics? So the way we presented in class was, we said the goal was, first of all, to split how you define ethics from how you design for ethics, but to articulate ethics as a set of principles, not rules, but principles. To articulate that those principles will have tensions among them, that you don't necessarily need to set a checklist that's going to be logically coherent. You can do something that will last for a long time and be flexible for new situations by stating general principles that may not necessarily always fit well together, but to articulate those tensions. And then after you've articulated what you mean when you define ethics, then you articulate how you're going to design for ethics. So what we talk about when we talk about ethics, again, Professor Selganik's discussion of this was useful for me for thinking of ethics as having a part of it that's about philosophy, which is a nice, happy place for me because I was raised in mathematics, and for me, when I think about philosophy, I think about logic, and logic makes me think about math, and math makes me think about proof, and proof is like a happy place for me, right? Because proofs are unassailable, and it's clean, and I don't need to worry about thinking really hard. Once I know the proof, it's done. Or maybe you were raised a computer scientician, and logic makes you think about computer science, which is nice because then it makes you think about clean things like an application programming interface and separation of concerns and good abstractions. And that sort of living in an abstract level is your happy place. However, there's another part about ethics, which is, again, how we design for ethics. So I can come up with 5 different ethical systems listed as a set of principles. What makes one better than the other? It's not necessarily about its logical coherence or about its excellence as an abstraction. It's really about whether or not your internal stakeholders buy into it and believe in the legitimacy of that ethical review. And more so, whether the external stakeholders buy into it and believe in the legitimacy of that ethical review. So philosophy can be useful because it can help you design ethics, but you're still not done. You still need to think about how you design for ethics. And the danger, of course, is that you build a system where what you're really interested in is the buy-in, not even from the internal stakeholders, but from the external stakeholders. So if you design an ethical system and it's really aimed at just making sure that the external stakeholders buy into it, then you run the risk of going into PR, or as Meredith Whittaker says, ethics theater, which is a sad place. So the goal for people thinking about how we construct a working systems of ethics is balancing defining ethics with designing for ethics. And the first of those definitely leverages philosophy. Philosophy can be useful in defining ethics. But the second, how you design for ethics, because it's about the art of consensus, is really a sociological act. So that's the way we taught about it in our class. Now, we can take Belmont as an example of this. So everyone in this room already knows the Belmont Principles. Respect for personhood is the first. It's in the 70s, the main aspect of that was informed consent. We now live in a digital age in which informed consent is a murky concept, particularly when dealing with private companies and everything they do with our data and all the ways that we use their free services in exchange for free spying on us all the time, as Eben Moglen put it. And now, more often people think about that in terms of respect for the autonomy of the people. Are they given a chance to make autonomous decisions about how their data is used? Beneficence, you've already studied. Do no harm is sort of a broad, but perhaps not so useful way of thinking about beneficence, because after all, I can do no harm by never talking to you or interacting with you. Rather, it's useful to think about beneficence in terms of maximizing benefit, clearly articulating and auditing and thinking through the risk. And justice, not in the sense of did you obey the law, but were things fair? One abstraction, again, not to say that abstraction is the right way to go for everything, but one abstraction that's useful is the veil of ignorance, which is the idea, are you setting up a system such that you would be happy to be any of the participants, any of the stakeholders? So when you set up, say, Uber as a system for a bunch of people, would you be equally happy to be the driver, the passenger, the company, right? If so, then you've satisfied this veil of ignorance. Ignorance meaning ignorance as to which part you're going to play in the eventual systems. So when things work well, this framing of ethics gives you something analytical, possibly hierarchical. Belmont certainly does that. It says here are the 3 principles. Here are standards that derive from those principles. Here are rules that might follow from those standards. And durable in the sense that, like Belmont's been around since the late 70s, and people are still using it as the basis for their interaction design. There's probably others we could come up with, but that is one example where I think people have shown that starting with general principles gives you a durable framework. What is that framework useful for? Well, it's useful for an ethical audit of decisions, both before you've made them and after you've made them. Although for the people who are the internal stakeholders, you really mostly need that before you've made the decision, from which the rules should derive. So this is my thinking about it, but there's a very similar way of thinking about it that's in the literature. This was a recent paper called Ethics as an Escape from Regulation, from ethics washing to ethics shopping. So the author here was particularly interested in how companies create ethical frameworks. By talking about it as an escape from regulation, he's clearly saying we need to make sure that ethical standards that a company creates are not somehow a substitute for the kind of consumer protections that regulations were meant to enforce. So how do you create something that works? He says, first step, get external participation, engage with all relevant stakeholders, not just the internal stakeholders. Again, you would like to construct an ethical system that not only has buy-in from the internal stakeholders, but also the people who are going to be affected by those decisions. Provide a mechanism for external independent oversight. As you've heard, the Belmont as a definition and as a design has limited input from researchers in order that you don't get the situation that the researchers say, yep, that's a good idea, let's do it. Ensure transparent decision-making processes on why decisions are taken. Again, the why, I think, is one example of why having some understanding of philosophy is useful. Right? Having some philosophical principles gives something we can agree to. Develop a stable list of non-arbitrary standards. Again, you can't violate your ethical principles if you don't write down ethical principles. So you need to write down what your principles are. And ensure that those ethics are consistent with human rights. So if your ethical system is, I don't know, move fast and break things, or if your ethical system is get rich, die trying, or something, then you're not necessarily in concord with something that external stakeholders are going to agree to. Fundamental human rights is a good anchor. And provide a clear statement of the relationship between commitments made and existing legal or regulatory frameworks which may be in conflict. That is, you may have an ethical system which conflicts with local laws in some country where you're interested in doing business. So you may be interested in doing business, but if you want to be an international company, it would be great to have some set of principles that your internal employees and external stakeholders from other countries are going to buy into. Okay, so you can take that framework and think about what happened at Belmont and analyze it in that framework. So principles were articulated. Those principles, as I'm sure you discussed from chapter 6, are also consistent with norms, rights, and philosophy. Right? Those principles didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a lot of hard work and were informed by both philosophical principles and societal norms. The tensions were articulated. That is, there wasn't a claim by the authors of Belmont that the principles were going to be straightforward and easy to follow, like a checklist or like an API. There was an understanding that those principles would have tensions. For example, ends versus means, I'm sure is something you talked about already. And then, after you've articulated the principles, then you articulate a design that will support them. So in chapter 6, I'm sure you talked about one particular design, a general case of interaction design, namely the IRB. So what are the designs there? Well, there's interaction design, there's process design, and in the case of Belmont, that led to the IRB process. But in a company or in some other community, there's a very different dynamic among powers, and therefore there may be a very different design that enforces that definition. Right, and I'm using design in a pretty loose sense. I'm using it in this sense from Mike Montero. Design is the intentional solution to a problem within a set of constraints. Implicit in that, and that definition is very general, but implicit is the role of powers, right? Somebody gets to decide what's the problem, somebody gets to decide what is the constraints, somebody gets to decide what constitutes a solution. Okay, so that was week 12. In terms of a lab, like I said earlier, we made our own database of ruin. We took PII from students, and then we made it more anonymous under K anonymity as a technical definition. And then for week 13, to try to articulate some of the problems, we looked at this ancient video from 1973, which, as far as I know, introduced the phrase, "You are the product." It was a video about television advertising. And then looked at an ancient paper from 1997 about the attention economy and the web, right in early days of World Wide Web. We coupled the advertising economy with the venture model. So we looked at this book by Annalise Saxenian about venture capital, the impact of venture capital on information platforms. This was a nice article by a law professor where he thinks about fake news and Tide Pods as different points on a spectrum. And then looked at this paper recent paper, again, we like to include some recent stuff by a Silicon Valley investor about the problems with blitzscaling. Blitzscaling meaning basically you provide so much venture capital that you just buy an entire market, for example, transportation. By the time we got to week 14, students were interested in hearing not just about the dumpster fires, but about potential solutions. So by looking at solutions, we wanted some sort of intellectual framework for organizing potential solutions. So the framework I used was one that I adopted from another venture capitalist, Bill Janeway, who was interested in the three-party game, the unstable three-party game that drives new company formation, in which you have private companies, for example, private investors. You have the government, which both creates regulation, but also often invests in new companies. And then you have the private market. So in the case of Janeway, he was thinking about sources of money, but I think we can take the same cartoon and think about sources of power. So the dumpster fires that most of the students were interested in and that we read about in the first week or two of the class were largely about the impact of private companies on individuals and about the way individuals look to the government to constrain the behavior of those private companies. Why would the government or the state be interested in that? Well, because the state derives its power from the consent of the governed, and people can drive them out of office if senators don't try to enforce regulations that protect people. So that's a type of unstable power dynamic. One of the things we tried to introduce to students was the fact that they as individuals, or individuals more generally, also have their own role in shaping corporate powers, and that different corporations have a role in shaping the way that different corporations behave. One notable example of that is the press, right? The press is itself a set of private corporations, and they have a non-trivial impact on the way that companies behave. You could flesh out other legs as well. The IRB, for example, is really a statement about the way the state constrains private corporations, for example, universities. The universities then pass on those laws to individuals, namely the employees. Why does the state do that? Well, because elected officials want to remain elected, and they're interested in showing that taxpayer money is being used ethically, as opposed to, for example, Tuskegee. So in terms of corporate solutions, we looked at this nice recent paper, Privacy as a Competitive Advantage, tracing many companies actually using almost exactly the same phrase for that. And in terms of state enforcing power on companies, we read this recent paper by René DiResta, which sort of goes through a set of different regulations that are either recent or contested in their interpretation. Also this article from our local paper about Lena Khan, who's encouraging people to revisit what are the principles behind antitrust regulation. Some examples from the René DiResta piece are GDPR, California's own privacy law. René makes passing reference to hipster antitrust, which is what enemies of Linda Khan have tried to dismiss her and her colleagues as. Communications Decency Act, Section 230 is a great example where a law was proposed to try to limit transmission of information. In Section 230, ISPs managed to get a carve-out to protect internet platform companies so that they shouldn't be liable. And then the original intent of the law was totally struck down as unconstitutional in ACLU versus Reno, but Section 230 remained. So it was sort of a boomerang where the law was created to try to limit certain information. There was a carve-out. The original intent was struck down, but the carve-out remains, which is why so many information platform companies portray themselves as legally protected. In terms of people power, we tried to remind students that they themselves have power, right? I mean, we think about people having people power as individuals or collectively by, for example, boycotting companies, but you also boycott companies when you deny them their data or when you deny them your own talent. So we talked about, we, again, trying to appeal to recent literature. We read this paper from January called The Tech Revolt, which was useful, among other reasons, because it has this, this long list of examples of technologists and collective action, and how technologists at Google and other tech companies have worked together to constrain policies at that company. The final thing we read was this report from the AI Now Institute in 2018, which was particularly useful because it talks about the limits of tech solutions. So there's a sense among technologists that we like our happy place where there's proofs and math. And part of what I thought was useful about this was to say there's a limit to the extent to which fairness could be made an API, for example. You know, that these are systemic problems. What did we, the faculty, learn? Well, we learned that it's possible to integrate history and ethics throughout. I mean, you can take a technological subject and you can teach it chronologically. Once you've broken it into transformations, it's easy to draw parallels to today. I hope that that was clear. If not, I invite you to go check out the syllabus, and you will see very modern sounding things in the debates of the 70s and the way people were subjectively collecting and modeling data in the 19th century. And we learned that all of these capabilities rearrange power. So a corollary of that is that the story of data is really a story of truth and power, and how that truth and power is contested. You know, from the 19th century onward, as soon as people started collecting data, they did it with their own interests. And they did it to establish what's true and to use those capabilities as new powers. Usually when people develop new powers, they're using it to defend their own power rather than to empower the defenseless. So looking over the arc of the class, you know, we looked at all of these intellectual transitions and asked who was in power, who sponsored that? Was it coming from academia, from the Victorian program of the 19th century? Was it military? Was it corporate interests? And then finally, to give students some sense for the future, we said if you want to understand the future, you should look at where are the present contests among those powers, which is why things like, you know, reinterpretation of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, right? That's an example of a contest that's happening right now. And as those contests are settled, just like cold fusion was settled, they have a big bifurcation on the future of, well, the future of data. So I'll close with these two infographics, which I think summarize two of the things we learned from the class. One, that the story of data is really a story of truth and power. And so it's useful to have some sort of analytical framework for understanding power. And that the ethics of data are not simple, right? They're not as simple as high philosophy. They're not even as simple as just saying, let's take the IRB and just apply it to other contexts, right? The design of IRB was relevant to a particular set of powers. And when you move to a different environment, for example, an individual corporation, there may be a different dynamics of power and therefore a different design to enforce those principles. And with that, I will close and take time for questions. Thank you very much.
Please remember to pass the mic so people on the live stream can hear.
Thanks. That was fascinating. I especially enjoyed the part hearing about the history of regression and something about random forest getting an F for interpretability. I'm wondering if you could stretch out some of the implications of that for how data science is applied today. Like, for example, we talked about the fragile families challenge and how even these machine learning models that data scientists just love to throw at everything have somewhat better performance, but end up being kind of like qualitatively the same as a basic regression model. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that kind of like cognitive lapse in a lot of thinking today about these things.
Yeah, it's a good subject. So let me just, I think your question was about interpretability. Oh, no, I'm good, thanks. As you're saying that, I realized we left out another paper that we read by Cynthia Rudin that was specifically about interpretability. So, you know, that any learned model, including Yule's model, right, has limits in terms of interpretation, right? It's different from AI 1.0, which was a set of heuristics and expert systems when you learn the model from data. One of the ways that you don't know how to interpret the model is how will this data behave on some new distribution? So you trained it for one set of people and their images, and then you deploy it, and there's a totally different demographic group that's doing image tagging, and you can't really predict how that thing's going to work. The other thing, of course, is causality, which is well known. that you take this model and it may be predictive on the data set you've used, but if you go in and intervene, you may lose all predictive power. And so interpretability challenges you in terms of how the model will perform on some new data set, for example, some new demographic group, how the model will or will not have structural interpretation, which means that you can go in and change one thing and you'll still retain predictive power. And then, of course, there's edge cases. So design is full of examples of people deploying a product and they test it on themselves or they test it on their friends, and then when they deployed it in the wild, it did something that they didn't interpret at all, or people used it in an adversarial way, and the designer dismisses that as an edge case. So that's one of the reasons why interpretability has a lot of fear associated with it in data science, because we're deploying products and we definitely can't predict what these models will do in all the different edge cases, meaning all the different future uses, particularly adversarial uses. I think the way it's related to ethics is that, again, getting back to the idea that Belmont's principles, I think, are durable, but Belmont's implementation was for a particular set of powers. When you deploy software as a service, when you deploy, a feed, I think you have an obligation to monitor people's experience with it, right? And it's very difficult to recall a gun. It's very difficult to recall a car, but it's very easy to modify an algorithm. In fact, for any information platform company, you're being subjected to different algorithms all the time under A/B testing. I would say the way that it's relevant is as these models get more complicated, you don't stand a chance as the designer of having predictive power for what's going to happen in every adversarial use case in every demographic group. And therefore, I think it becomes an ethical principle or an ethical design to monitor the way people use it and to intervene as things have negative impact in ways you wouldn't have predicted.
Thank you. So I really appreciate the kind of a democratic framework you described for establishing the ethics involved in algorithms and data science. But two questions I have are, first, how to think about the public's level of expertise or familiarity with algorithms, and especially as there's a broader and broader gap between what it's like to interact with them as a user and what goes into them on the other end. And kind of the second part of that is what those of us who do research with these tools, how we can communicate with the public in a way that facilitates that kind of democratic discourse.
I don't know that I understand the question. So, I'm sorry, can you refine the question?
So, a piece of technology like a computer in the 60s,
Yeah.
a person using the computer, it's not a very easy experience.
Yes.
But people who talk to Alexa or talk to Siri, it's very easy to interact and contribute data
Yes.
to these platforms. And it's probably harder to understand the implications of those interactions or how that data is used and managed.
Yeah.
And so, as much as I'm on board for, trying to encourage democratic discussion and a real social understanding of the implication of these platforms, I'm wondering, what's the best way to do that in light of those challenges? And the second part, which is just a related question, is how can we as researchers contribute to that?
I would say teach classes like this. So maybe a useful cartoon is the one worked out by Stuart Selber in 2004 in the book Multiliteracies for a Digital Age. So I don't really like the word literacies, but I'm going to draw on that particular work. So Stuart Selber is an English professor at Penn State, and sort of getting annoyed at hearing everybody say everybody should learn how to code. He said, what do we really mean by saying everybody should be computationally literate? Right? For some people, it would be great if they knew how to code in C or Fortran or whatever. But what we really want as a society is for everybody to be rhetorically and critically literate. So I do think there's an opportunity for all of us who are teaching data science to think about what we mean by having people have, making sense of data science. Because what we want is for everybody to have all three of those things. We may not have everybody have functional literacy. We may not have everybody, doing deep learning. But we could probably have everybody be critically literate and rhetorically literate. Rhetorical literacy, meaning you know how to take the output of say, an algorithm and know what it implies and know how to advance your cause or advance your narrative using that output. And critical literacy, hugely important, which is when somebody comes at you and says, I'm denying you a loan because the algorithm says so, even if you don't know how to code up logistic regression, you should be able to know, well, wait, that's because you trained it on this data set. You know, it has to be consistent with these laws, right? That's sort of critical literacy you can teach without asking anybody to understand flip-flops, you know, like internal memories or anything like that, right? So, however, you know, what is the you know, core curriculum of critical literacy is going to be different in different ages and different decades. But I think that's one of the things we can do is we can stop sort of putting functional literacy as the sole type of literacy we're aiming for. And just as Stuart Selber emphasized in this 2004 book, you know, what we really want as a functioning society is to help everyone get to rhetorical and critical literacies. Gina Neff describes this field as critical data studies. So there is a field being born, Gina Neff and others are creating it, in critical data studies, which is distinct from, but certainly overlapped with, how to crush code to, you know, develop a deep learning model to detect cat faces or something.
Really fantastic talk, and just like wonderful overall, lots of fascinating ideas. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to limit myself to only a couple here. So the first is just, I think that we learn so much from our colleagues, from our students especially, and as you've taught this course, I'm sort of curious if there are sort of ethically ambiguous situations or case studies that have come straight from your students that you hadn't thought of already. So something that was, you know, a new technology that was that fit into your syllabus in a new way. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I mean, I would say so. We used Slack heavily. So students were required to post a brief discussion on Sunday night by 11:59 New York City time in the discussion channel, and then separately was a links channel. So I would say I learned a lot from the students just because they all posted a lot of stuff in the links channel. So some of it was coming from students, but it was coming from students being a good eye for interesting problems that were being discussed somewhere on the internet. Particularly around gendered use of technology, there was a lot of posts that week for gendered uses of technologies that I wasn't clued into. In terms of ethical problems, I think I was struck by how technology students wanted to push back on, you know, whether, you know, information platforms are bad, you know, and sort of, you know, there was some straw man argumentation like, you can't just say all social media is bad, which nobody had said up until that point. But I don't know that I got a good example of a ethical conundrum that I hadn't thought of. I think most of all, they were really good eyes for scouring the web and surfacing for the class discussion things that otherwise I alone would have missed.
Okay. And just the second question is about, I was really curious about the term ethical theater.
Yeah.
And so Facebook developing a sort of ethical review process for research and whatnot. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about some of the trends that are happening in ethical theater, like what you see corporations doing in order to pretend to be ethical.
Yeah, so let me not tell you mine. Let me tell you Meredith's. Okay. So Meredith Whitaker is a Google employee. She's the person who I'm quoting with the phrase ethical theater. So I think one of the things that Meredith was particularly drawn to was Google's very short-lived AI Principles board. They had like an AI board that lasted, I think, a week or two in April in the face of a lot of protests. Some of the articles we read took Tim Cook to task for saying that Apple is an ethical company because of its privacy stakes around hardware, in contrast to the way it engages in other countries where the laws of that country may be dissonant with human rights conceptions. I think in general, divorcing design from define happens all the time. I've been in conversations with people where they say things like, well, ACM has a list of principles, therefore problem solved. Right? So I think people conflate define and design easily. So that's one of the things that I think can be an example, is if you have somebody who's just doing design or just doing define, then they're sort of not putting it together. IRB is a good example because IRB has with it a set of teeth coming from the state and state's funding. So just saying we're going to make an ORB and it's going to be just like the IRB, but not recognizing that the lifeblood of IRB is cash money is coming from the US government, sort of robs it of its teeth. Please.
So, great talk.
Thank you.
Love this so much. I think
Great.
all, social scientists, especially social scientists who use quantitative methods, need to have some course like this.
Great.
Where we understand where our methods are coming from.
Great.
And so, for me, it's really interesting to see someone who seems to be passionate about understanding how these tools and these data can be used as tools of oppression, and then thinking about some of the suspect things that are printed out on the New York Times. I'm thinking particularly about the Upshot, which is all about using data, and within the last month they published a story about immigrants committing less crime than native-born Americans. And this data source that they use is the FBI crime reporting statistics, which is inherently biased, right? And we as social scientists who understand how, crime statistics are collected and things of that nature, understand that they are biased.
Yeah.
We also know that this nation has a history of using crime statistics to help incorporate immigrants into our society by saying that they were redeemable, while African Americans were not. And in some ways, by using this data source to prove that immigrants are committing less crime than native-born Americans, it is legitimizing the bad data.
Right.
And so that way, people are able to then say, well, maybe blacks do commit more crime, or these statistics are, representative of what's happening in our society. And so I'm wondering, how do you, wearing your very different hats, integrate these things?
So let's talk about press in general, and then we can talk about my hats. So press in general, they're human beings. If you write something that shows them up, they care about it, right? So if you show up a journalist, more than once and show them as being bad, they'll notice it. And they might even hire you, right? So I encourage you to articulate it, right? Put it on Medium, put it in a paper, put it somewhere.
I put it in the comment box, but
that is a great start. Okay. These people don't exist on some ethereal plane. They're in the real. They're on the subway. You let them know. And they don't like being shown up. They'll pay attention if somebody critically shows them up, or publish it in their opponent's paper, right? Because they have peers, and they have peer review, just like higher ed, right? Now, as to my hats, one of my hats is at the New York Times, and I don't include in this talk, but I will tell you a slide that I usually include in my talks about that, which is the church-state divide. So in terms of the church-state divide, church is the people who possess and defend the craft of journalism and have deadlines. And I'm on state. So I'm not on the Upshot. I know those people, support them, happy to talk to them anytime they want to talk. But I can't claim, none of my hats involve direct agency in that article or any other article.
So then what do you do as the chief data scientist at the New York Times?
Well, that's a different talk. So I have a different talk, which is about my work at the New York Times. But that is on the business side, right? So as Professor Salganik can tell you, my group doesn't have deadlines. My group is doing things like building recommendation engines, trying to allocate how many copies of the newspaper should go to stores that sell single copies, understanding who reads what where. So I do not possess the craft of journalism, right? I'm state. So I can't claim any personal agency for that article or any other. But I do encourage you to take everything you just said, which is totally true, and even before you said the word legitimize, that's the verb I was thinking of, just to take somebody else's biased data, which is represented as being a data set of crimes, when it's really a data set of arrests, for example, right? And by doing any analysis of it without being critical of it, you legitimize the data set. Totally agree with you. I encourage you to write it up and put it in Washington Post.
This is fascinating. I think one of the core themes in your talk is about relationship between power and data. And I kind of think about in a way I think about what data is more becoming available and what is not becoming available. So if you think about like data about average people, you're getting more data from social media or the government statistics and so on. But if you think about like powerful people in the country, in this country or outside, it's kind of hard to get, right? If you talk about lobbying or the way they talk about issues, like, or just to how they learn about data. So they get some data from FBI or other agencies, and what kind of things they infer from data, how they learn it, and how they apply that to the way they make policies and so on. So it seems that inequality we've seen in the past also degenerated in the way you collect data and the way we can use it. So I wonder whether you have any comments and thoughts about like how we can change the situation as a sort of scientist.
Right. So first, let's expand on the phrase "hard to get." So the person who collected and possesses the data has interests that may make some data sets easier to get or harder to get. So like if you have an interest, you may have an interest in not only making the data easy to get, but promoting that data set and making sure everybody knows, here's this data set, go analyze it as you want, because that person knows that the data was collected in a certain way that advances something. For example, just labeling any data set as a crime data set when it's really an arrest data set. Just by choosing that regular expression, you were advancing a particular model of how the world is. But in terms of what are our powers, you know, it depends on whether the data set is sitting in a private company or in a government or with an individual. There's always some balance of power among people connected in a society. But I don't have a general answer for how to liberate a data set, because it'll be different to every state or corporate or people power that's defending access to the data set. But I mean, again, that gets back to critical literacy. I encourage you to remain critical and to think through power dynamics when somebody creates or distributes a data set. How is that data set advancing a particular model of what's true?
Okay, hi. I think many of your discussions are under a democratic setting. So do you know, I'm interested in, do you know of some useful, probably historical discussions on how an authoritarian regime play with the ethics of data and how a democratic society interacts with such an authoritarian regime? Maybe stories from the Russian, just any.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that my presentation is very U.S. centric. It's the system that I know best, and also the companies that are focus of most concerns are U.S. based companies. I think there's some great examples of data being put to adversarial use. In Chapter 6 of Bit by Bit, there's a good example of census data in Germany being put to use in ways that the people who collected the census data were not anticipating. You know, that later government would be interested in particular demographic columns or attributes that were not considered sensitive columns at the time that they were collected. So I would say the use of data by the Third Reich would be many, many PhDs worth of information, because it's a well-studied case of people putting data to work. In terms of other country, I don't know that I have a general lesson to learn about the way other countries use data. Sorry.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I found it really fascinating. I wanted to I think my question will sort of dovetail off of Victoria's. So I found the association between the close association between ethics and sociology pretty interesting, and I wanted to sort of dig down that rabbit hole a little bit. So as we sort of know from Sarah Igo's work, among sort of others, we know that social scientists have really been sort of pioneers in the use of social data and the sort of techniques for analyzing it.
Yes.
And so I wonder if we might be sort of, if perhaps it might be wise for us to be a little more skeptical of how social scientists think about the ethics of these data sources, and whether perhaps other academic professionals might be a little bit better positioned to sort of help us think about that.
Is there a particular prior work by social scientists that makes you think we should be skeptical?
So, for example, there's like experimental work in psychology that had sort of more sort of questionable sort of ethical principles to it.
Yeah.
Just sort of in general, I think that there's a sort of the history of social science ethics is fairly fraught. And so I wonder if we might sort of think about, and for example, the Belmont report was authored by like biomedical experts and lawyers.
Yeah,
so
and administrators, absolutely. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, where you're designing, I think the consensus that you will get both from internal and external stakeholders is enhanced if there's not too many people from one group, professionally or otherwise, that are getting to decide what's ethical. So Belmont was real clear about that. So here's a quote from the Belmont report itself. Commission's deliberations on institutional review boards began with the premise that investigators should not have sole responsibility for determining whether something is ethical. Others who are independent of the research must share this responsibility because investigators have a potential conflict by virtue of their concern with the pursuit of knowledge. That's a very lofty way of thinking about it. I mean, these researchers are human beings, whether they know it or not. Right, so their conflict is not just about the pursuit of interest. I mean, these people have careers, right? One of the things when we read about Quetelet in 1835 and coming up with social physics is, how he wanted his own observatory in Belgium. I mean, like these people had careers they wanted to advance as human beings, and that shaped their findings as well. So absolutely, I think you need to have I think you as an external stakeholder should have skepticism about any design for ethics that has only one group inside, whether it's intellectual or otherwise. Consider the fact that California Bar Review doesn't just have lawyers on it, right? Or any bar association isn't just lawyers, right? It's supposed to have external people who are impacted, or any other licensing function for some professional licensing, any licensed profession, right? Which a profession becomes licensed when everyone agrees that that profession can do a lot of damage. And those review boards are not supposed to be made of people who are drawn from that profession alone. It should have external stakeholders. Great, thank you.
So both these questions touch upon an earlier topic, which was sort of this Western focus in your presentation. First, Mateo from our RTI site states, your course sounds super interesting and very relevant, but hearing your talk and taking a very quick look at the syllabus, it seems centered mostly in Western examples and authors. What are your thoughts on some of the topics you mentioned today that could behave differently or have been historically presented differently in places other than Europe and U.S.? You mentioned the Germany example. I don't know if there are other examples or thoughts that you might elaborate on.
I completely agree, and it's sufficiently outside my expertise that I think the most honest answer is I look forward to learning more, and I hope that my email address is up there, and I hope that people will send me better references so that I can have a less Western-centric presentation in future years. Here's my email address. And in terms of alternative systems of ethics, it's absolutely right that the core curriculum I'm drawing on is a curriculum that's extremely Western-centric, and that's just a statement about that's the only expertise I have at this point. But I'm always happy to learn.
So this question from Kartik in Boston is a bit more future-oriented. Given local and the international power dynamics, and given high concentration of technological development in the West, how can we avoid the risk of our discourse on ethics becoming Western ethics? In other words, how can our discourse on ethics vis-a-vis technology become more inclusive?
Right. Well, I mean, most places are not shackled by the edge that's pointing from corporations to state in the U.S. I mean, if we're talking about the potential damage done by information platform companies that are U.S.-centered, and those information platform companies have abundant financial and legal relationships with the U.S. state, it colors what regulations are possible. Other territories, even Europe, right, have shown leadership. So I would say other nations are actually unencumbered by many of the constraints that make it so difficult for the U.S. to return to the era of consumer protections that Sarah Igo writes about from the 70s. GDPR is a great example, and other countries are free to enact laws that because of internationalization, these companies have to abide by and can stand as a leadership examples to other companies. We didn't talk about, well, I brought up World War II earlier, but we didn't talk about the fact that in Twitter, in Germany, denying the Holocaust is illegal, right? So Twitter and other companies have clearly found ways to censor, or at least not amplify, content that violates that German law. Those companies are active in Germany, right? So internationalization is fantastic for illustrating what's both legally conceivable and what's technologically doable. Those external design constraints actually drive innovation in ways that protect consumers.
All right. Oh, we have another one. Okay. Harry from Boston asks, can you comment on cross-national flows of information and efforts to regularize standards, rules, and laws? Are we still in the state of nature at the international level, or is there some order to governing the interest of the internet and large information flows? Do states have the capacity to regulate this space?
I mean, a sovereign government can decide anytime they want what corporations are and are not allowed to be active in that sovereign space. The standardization largely comes about from corporate interests, right? So like when Epic, as an electronic health records company, decides they're going to go into Denmark and say, you're going to do it our way now, it's a type of standardization that's driven by corporate interests rather than state interests. Now, the government of Denmark could decide that Epic is banned. I encourage all of you to Google what happened in Denmark when Epic decided that they were going to take over all the electronic health records of Denmark. Yeah, I mean, government, as one of the functions of government is consumer protection and protecting people. And one of the ways that it does that is by regulating corporate interests. But the corporations have much more interest than the governments in standardization because corporations are interested in internationalization. So I would say that's a tension, but if people, governments govern with the consent of the governed, so if people demand more consumer protection in those countries, it's an opportunity for the companies that wish to remain active in those jurisdictions to innovate in ways that are gonna protect consumers.
Okay, with that, let's give a round of applause for Chris.
Thank you, Matt.